Today we'll be talking about the steering control systems and mainly about the safety and system control requirements of the autopilot, as well as the checks and tests required of the steering gear before vessel's departure. Alright, so these are the topics we'll be covering today under the steering control systems. Previously I have made a couple of videos about the steering control systems. I'll give you the links to those videos as well in the description section below. But this video focuses only on the testing of the steering gear before departure. What are the requirements and what are the system and safety requirements of a steering gear control system or an autopilot system on the ship. So we'll start with the safety requirements of a control system. So we talk about steering control systems here, that it must be possible to change over from auto steering to manual control immediately. At any point of time you should be able to switch between the two. Alright, you should be able to switch between the auto control to manual and vice versa. Under conditions of restricted visibility or hazardous navigational situations, a helmsman should always be available on the ship's bridge for steering purposes. Manual steering would be better under those conditions because manual steering responds faster, the ship responds faster to the manual steering. Changeover procedures between manual and automatic systems must be under supervision of a responsible officer. So when you change over the steering control systems from manual to auto and vice versa, it must be done under the supervision of a responsible officer, and that would be a certified officer on the bridge. Do not allow your helmsmen or training officers or steering or lookouts to come and do the changeover. Alright. Manual steering must be tested after prolonged use of the automatic heading or track control systems and prior to entering areas of navigation requiring special caution. So especially if you have been on a long sea voyage and you've been using the auto control system throughout the sea voyage, because in open sea you don't need to necessarily use manual steering all the time. It is a good idea for you to always check the manual steering at least once every watch, and it must be done definitely before you start entering the coastal areas or pilotage waters. Make sure that you test your manual steering before you enter those restricted waters or areas of high traffic. Because that is not the point of time that you find out that the manual steering is not working, and then you will be in trouble, right? What are the control system requirements for a track control system? So for those of you who don't know what a track control system is, I've made a video on that as well. A track control system of an autopilot basically gets the additional feedback from a GPS. So the vessel can steer a series of courses based on the waypoint information fed into the GPS. So a track control system of an autopilot requires the following system requirements. So it needs the following information to be displayed continuously and clearly. So the mode of steering, whether it's autopilot or whether it's auto or manual or any other mode of steering. Sources of actual position. So which source are you obtaining the position from in the autopilot? So it could be a GPS, and mainly it's a GPS. The heading of the autopilot, the course, the speed of the vessel, the status and failure of the sensors. And when we say sensors, the sensors could be low oil level alarms, or it could be off-course alarms. So basically those sensors. The actual position of the vessel, so basically the GPS position. The cross-track distance as well as speed. So if there is any cross-track error, and what is the speed at that point of time. So cross-track error is when the vessel deviates from its original course or the course on which it's supposed to be heading. The details of the next waypoint. So normally the GPS coordinates of the next waypoint and the course and distance to the next waypoint is displayed as well. Time and distance to the next waypoint. The next course that is going to be steered after reaching the waypoint. And finally the selected track information. So on that particular course, when you are steering a particular course, what is the course made good, and what is the distance to the next waypoint, or how much cross-track error, all that information should be displayed all the time. So what is the testing and drill requirements for a steering gear systems? So before you depart vessel, the steering gear must be tested by a certified officer. That's normally a navigational officer who tests the steering gear along with an engineer officer who's in the engine room. Alright, so the system is normally, the procedure is that within 12 hours prior to departure you must test the steering gear. Alright, so why we say 12 hours is because if anything wrong is found with the steering gear, it will give the engineers or the vessel enough time to find out and rectify uh, the the mistakes or the errors or the why or whatever is wrong with the steering gear. It gives the vessel time. Otherwise, if at the end moment or just 1 hour before departure, if you find out something is wrong with the steering gear, then the vessel and the staff of the vessel, the crew of the vessel, do not have enough time to find out and rectify whatever is wrong with the steering gear. All right, so 12 hours prior to departure, you must test the steering gear. The other bridge equipment may be tested a couple of hours before departure, but steering gear should be tested at least 12 hours. So what all do you test in a steering gear testing? So you test the operation of the main steering gear as well as the auxiliary and the remote steering gear. All right, so you have the auxiliary steering and you have the remote steering functions available to you. So of course the main steering is the when you use the main steering gear and everything, but sometimes you have provisions for auxiliary steering or remote steering, such as from the steering gear flat as well you can steer the vessel. So if the navigation officer gives orders from the bridge, an engineer or somebody else in the steering gear flat may steer the vessel using the remote steering gear or the auxiliary function of the steering gear. So in that case you must test the autopilot, the steering wheel, the non-follow-up and the follow-up joysticks, the push buttons, if any, on the bridge wing console positions, and if there are any remote control plug-in units, all of them should be tested under this test. Then you must test the rudder angle indicators, and you do that by giving different rudder orders on the ship's wheelhouse or in the ship's wheelhouse, and you ask the engineer in the steering gear flat or in the engine room to correspond by giving you the rudder angle indicator, whatever the rudder angle indicator is reading. So basically this means that whatever rudder angle indicator provides information on the wheelhouse, the same information should be displayed in the engine room as well, and that should be what you put on the steering wheel. So whatever you put on the steering wheel, whatever rudder command you put on the steering gear, if it's 10 degrees starboard or 10 degrees port or 20 degrees port or 30 degrees on the starboard, that should be indicated by the rudder angle indicator in the wheelhouse as well as in the engine control room. In the rudder angle indicator, you must test the main display, the display in the steering console, the bridge wing displays on the port and the starboard side bridge wings also display it, the steering gear display, so there's a steering gear, also there's a rudder angle indicator, and test for the rudder markings as well. So make sure that all these markings in the steering gear, so the steering gear has rudder markings there, on which the indicator moves according to the movement of the helm. So make sure in all the places you test and you check that the indicators are showing the same value of rudder that you are putting using the helm. So verify the full rudder movement. So many times this is done by putting hard over from hard over to hard starboard, or sometimes the engineer takes over the steering gear flat and they start putting the different commands, and that's what should be read on the bridge indicator as well. So these are the different ways that you test to make sure that irrespective of who has the rudder control, whether it's the bridge or the steering gear flat, the indicators should be working similarly. All right, so normally when one thing I forgot to mention previously is that you always check hard over to hard port to hard starboard and vice versa. So hard over from one side to hard over to the other side, based on SOLAS, it should take not more than 28 seconds. So these kind of tests are also done. So when you are checking the helm orders or the rudder angle indicators, make sure that one of the tests that you do is hard port to hard starboard or vice versa, and then calculate how many seconds it's taking, and you can note it down in the ship's logbook as well. Test for the emergency power supply as well. So make sure that if the main power supply goes off to the steering gear flat or to the autopilot or to the main gyro compass that feeds into the autopilot, these can be backed up by the emergency power supply. The steering gear power unit failure alarms should be tested as well. So in case there's a power failure, these alarms should be working. And visual inspection of the steering gear and linkages should be carried out as well. So if the bridge officer or the navigating officer may distribute some of this work with the engineering officer, but you have to ensure that all these checks and inspections are done, and all the checks and inspections that you carry out should be logged in the deck logbook as well as the engine logbook. And if there is something that you find is not functioning, a note of that must be made as well, and the senior most officer on the ship should be informed about it. Because basically when you're carrying out all these checks and you write down in the logbook that you have made these checks and everything was functioning well, you're making a legal declaration that you checked all these things. So in case tomorrow something goes wrong after departure, then an investigation will definitely ask you questions on how it was tested and who tested it and why was it functioning then and not functioning later on. So make sure you write down all the checks that you carry out. If you have not carried out checks, make sure that you write down that one as well. All right, because that's a legal declaration. Apart from all these tests, you must definitely test the communication between the bridge and the steering gear flat. So of course you test the communication between the bridge and the engine room, but make sure you ask the engineer or ask somebody from the engine room to go into the steering gear flat and then check for the communication between the bridge and the steering gear flat to ensure that the communication will work in case an emergency operation takes place. So normally all the operations during maneuvering, the engineers are in the engine room and the deck officers on the bridge. But if something goes wrong with the steering gear and the engineers have to take over, they will go into the steering gear flat and take over the emergency steering gear. For that, the communication between the bridge and the steering gear flat should be working. Otherwise, it becomes very challenging to conduct any kind of navigation. Alright, so there could be a telephone there, it could be sound power telephones, there could be battery power telephones, or there could be intercoms. Make sure whatever communication is present, you conduct those checks. If you have VHF walkie-talkies that work in the steering gear flat, make sure you check for them as well. So the main thing is to establish a mode of communication that will be used in case of an emergency. Alright, emergency steering gear testing must be done at least once every 3 months. So this is different from the ones in departure. So at departure, because the vessel is not at sea or in water, the emergency steering gear testing is kind of a remote testing. All right, so the engineers take over the steering gear flat and they put the vessel on different ham orders, and the bridge officer responds that yes, it's working. But the emergency steering gear testing must be done at sea while the vessel is underway every 3 months. So that is required as per ISM testing as well. And at this point of time, you navigate, you actually steer the vessel, and the steering gear drills are conducted in such a way that normally you allow most of the ship staff, you allow everyone to learn about the changeover procedures and also to operate the steering gear from the steering gear flat. The idea here is that everyone, irrespective of their rank or position on the vessel, should be able to conduct a changeover of the steering gear procedure. They should be able to change over from bridge steering gear to or auto or manual steering gear to emergency steering gear and carry out the steering operation from the steering gear flat. So that should be done at sea, and the vessel steers then various courses. Normally this is done in open sea when there is no traffic around, because safety of the vessel is paramount at all times. All right, finally, this is the changeover procedure that you see. The changeover procedure from manual to auto and vice versa, and from manual to emergency steering gear, all these changeover procedures should be displayed at all times in the bridge as well as in the steering gear flat. This is a legal requirement. If I'm not wrong, this is a legal requirement by SOLAS, and many times the posted officer or flagship officer or the ISM auditor may come and check for these instructions. Many a time these instructions are posted in the designated places and they are not maintained well, especially in the steering gear flat. So you have to make sure that a copy of these instructions, a clean copy of these instructions, is always posted at the designated positions, and it should be understood. It should be in the language or the official language of the ship that is understood by most of the people. Otherwise, translations should be provided, and instructions should be clear because ship's crew might be tested in the changeover procedures during audits or inspections. Alright, so this is like a block diagram which shows changeover procedures from the bridge to the steering gear and vice versa. So I hope this was a quick short lecture and was useful for you to understand what are the testing requirements of a steering gear and what all components of a steering gear are required to be tested. Also helped you to understand what are the control system requirements of a track control system of an autopilot, which is different from a heading control system. A heading control system only gets feedback from the gyro compass. So that is the only feedback, but the track control system has all these requirements because it's getting feedback, additional feedback from the GPS as well. All right, if there was something you didn't understand, if there was something you were not very sure about, make sure you write it to me in the comment section. For those of you who are following my videos regularly and giving me feedback, thank you very much. And for the rest of you who like my videos, who find these useful, please subscribe to these videos so that you get notification about the future videos that I'll be putting up. I'll see you soon with my next video on oral exam preparations. All the best with you.